everyone. My name is Mustafa. I am the president and founder of Legally Bright. By me, I have my colleague, VP, Anywho, and we are very excited for you all to join us here and have Mr. Steve Schwartz, founder of LSAT Unplugged, be here with us. Thank you so much, Steve, for willing to collaborate with us on this event and giving us an opportunity to ask a few questions about the LSAT and help our members get a better understanding of the new LSAT Flex. First, I would like to give Annie an opportunity to introduce herself and perhaps share anything that she likes.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, my name is Annie. Like Mustafa said, I am part of Legally Bright as well, and our objective with this Legally Bright is basically to help pre-law students and give them access to information around law school. So we're hoping that through this, pre-law students who are looking to take the LSAT or even interested in applying to law school will have the opportunity to talk to Steve, who is basically like an expert in LSAT and knows everything about the LSAT. And I think I should preface by saying that because I'm aware that we do have audience from, I guess, some from the States as well. Mustafa and I are actually Ontario law students, and we're based in Toronto. So just to preface that, and yeah, so that's basically what I have to say, and I think we can jump right into our discussion today.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a test that is not easy. Annie and I have been through it. I'm sure you have been through it. And it takes a lot of time and dedication. I personally had to put in at least 8 hours of studying a day while working part-time, trying to make money on the side. But it is definitely not an easy test. And for those who are willing to take the test, I highly encourage not to take it lightly and put in as much hours as possible. Annie?
Yeah, totally agreed. I think I made the mistake by, doing exactly what you said, leaving myself not enough time to study. And I was also kind of doing it after undergrad. And I probably only really studied hardcore for 2 to 3 months. So it was hard for me to get the score that I wanted. And I wish I would have left more time to study for the LSAT. I don't know if Steve, you have any, I guess, suggested timeline in terms of studying for the LSAT and just from your personal experience.
Yeah, I certainly do. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of folks will typically spend 2 to 3 months and invest that amount of time only in studying for the LSAT. And that's how a lot of traditional in-person prep classes would be organized. But in my view, in my experience, it typically takes 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on the exam. In my case, I studied for it kind of casually on the side at first, and I was in for a rude awakening when my scores stayed in the low 150s for several months when I was aiming for a top 14 law school. It ended up taking me an entire miserable year to achieve a 175 in the end. And I wish I had done a lot of things differently. I don't think it needs to take anybody a year, but definitely in my experience, those who tend to do the best tend to spend a bit longer, closer at least to 5 to 6 months.
Right.
That makes sense. I guess so. My next question is, a lot of students have been advised to take a diagnostic test before, studying for the LSAT, just to get a better idea of where they're starting. And I've heard of questions where it's like, if I'm starting in the low 140s or even 130s, do I have the potential to, aim for 100 and 160s, 170s? What's sort of your input on that?
Yeah, you certainly can. It just takes a lot of work. And that's a reason I don't typically recommend cold diagnostics. I rarely encounter anybody who's happy with their cold diagnostic having done no prior studying. And I'm curious to hear from both of you if you're willing to share what your initial diagnostic scores were and how things changed over time as you studied more.
I guess I can go first. The first test that I took on my own, I think I scored roughly, I believe it was a 143. And that was without studying for it. And for the first time, I just wanted to see where my skill set is and what areas I need really improvement. And then afterwards, I took a course and also did a diagnostic test there, scored roughly around the same range. And then I studied, as I said, 8 hours a day, try to improve some of the weaknesses that I was able to identify when taking the practice tests. And over time, just a lot of work and dedication, I was able to improve in certain sections. But the most difficult section for me was the logical reasoning. And there's two sections of that, I believe, in the LSAT, at least before LSAT Flex. And so that was a big sort of obstacle for me because since there are many questions on it, you need to do really well in that section to really get the score that you want or a competitive score. So most of my time went towards improving that section. I was fairly good at logic games and also reading comprehension. Reading comp was because I studied law and society for my undergrad, and I was sort of used to reading a lot of cases and being able to identify arguments, like the structure of the paper, and sort of weaken and strengthen what the authors were arguing in the case. So if you do have a background in reading legal cases or even writing essays, I think reading comprehension might be relatively easier. But in terms of logical reasoning and even logic games wasn't as difficult as logical reasoning, but that was sort of my experience. And over time, as you mentioned, Steve, you have to take roughly 6 months studying for it. I believe I studied after I graduated from undergrad. So I did 4 years of undergrad and I took a year off to study for the LSAT. And within that year, I studied approximately 7 months, I believe. And I also prepared my law school application. So I gave myself enough time to study for it. And eventually I was able to get a score competitive enough to get into Osgoode Hall Law School, which is a law school here in Toronto.
I really appreciate your sharing that, Mustafa, because I think too many people posting online, they only post about their success stories. They only post about the ending point, but they don't feel comfortable oftentimes sharing the starting point. And it's great to hear that you started in the low 140s, yet you were able to successfully get into a great law school. You're there now, you're obviously doing fine, and you can improve significantly. That's the key. So back to Annie's question, can you start in the 130s or 140s and improve significantly? Can you get into the 160s? Can you get into the 170s? You absolutely can. And I'm living proof of at least going from the low 150s to a 175. I've seen many students do the same. It just takes more work than folks initially might think. But like I said at the beginning, this is a harder exam than most, if not all, exams that the typical pre-law student has encountered up to this point. So it just takes more work and it takes more dedicated, focused time blocking it off in your schedule, which is hard to do, especially when you're in college and you've got other obligations that are actually scheduled by default. You've got to carve out time for the LSAT specifically, which requires a bit more deliberation than people might typically do at first.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of times when you actually feel like giving up because it becomes so frustrating when you keep practicing and practicing. And even after like 3 to 4 months, like my score wasn't as improved as I wanted it to be, like starting at around like 143. After like 3 months of practice, I had only improved by 7 points. I was at a 150. And then later on, as I practiced more and took another 4 to 5 months studying for it, eventually, I believe the highest score that I got in terms of practicing was a 168. And once I hit 168, I knew that it's possible to work on it and even improve some of the issues that I had with some of the questions that I wasn't able to answer properly. So once I took the test, the next day I would go over it again and sort of figure out where I did, what I did wrong, and sort of learn from your mistakes. And eventually, it's almost like a skill you have to gain, and that takes a long time for someone to master it. So giving yourself plenty of time would be helpful.
Yeah, I want to call out one thing you said, which I think is really important and doesn't get enough attention typically, which is learning from your mistakes, engaging in that in-depth review process. For me, that was the biggest breakthrough when I stopped taking exam after exam and obsessively measuring my results, tracking them on spreadsheets and hoping that something would magically change when, at that point, there were only, I think, 40 something numbered exams. Now there's 89 numbered exams. So there's nearly double available what there was back then. But even still, the default mode that a lot of students take is just taking all the exams in order, maybe starting with exam number 1, maybe starting with whichever random book they happen to have gotten from a friend. But it's not enough to simply take exams. You've got to first learn the theory and the concepts, then apply them, then figure out what you're getting wrong and why. So reviewing everything you get wrong, everything you have difficulty with. And I've been refining what I consider the ideal review process over time, and I'm still experimenting with it and encouraging students in my courses to do the same. But I've distilled the best I've learned up to this point in what I call the Socratic review method, where you analyze, let's say for logical reasoning, the short argument, also known as the stimulus, the question stem, and the answer choices to see exactly where your misunderstanding comes from, reviewing it in depth, even writing out your own explanations, articulating it out loud, not just in your head. Because in your head, it's too easy to say, oh, I get it now, and move on after looking at the answer key. But you've got to slow it down. I'll tell people, bring me the 3 to 5 hardest problems you've recently encountered, and we'll review them in excruciating detail. I had a class last week. We reviewed just one reading count passage, took us an entire hour. We didn't even get to all the questions, just that one passage. It's hard work, but that's the key. And I think a lot of it does relate to law school, reviewing in depth. But tell me your experience. What's it like in law school?
Oh, law school. I mean, some of the skills you gain through studying for the LSAT definitely helps. As I mentioned, like if you do well in the reading comprehension section, you're able to sort of figure out the arguments, the weaknesses, the strengths within a given paragraph. Then that certainly becomes useful when it comes to when you're studying for your law school exams or when you're completing cases, and even logic games. For example, recently in my torts class, we talked about how damages are distributed and how different parties are held liable. I mean, knowing how to navigate through some mathematical equations and being able to identify different elements within an argument that has like mathematical equations, I thought logic games really helped me in that sense. So it is like I've heard a lot of people say that the LSAT does not really say much about your intelligence, or it can't prove whether you can do well in law school or not. To an extent, that is true, but at the same time, I feel like the skills you gain through the LSAT certainly be helpful and useful when it comes to completing law school readings or doing well in the exams, and even in everyday life. I mean, it's important skills to have, even when you're arguing with someone, or even when you're presenting or engaged in a conversation, an intellectual one. So definitely it has more perks than just academic.
I think on my part, I appreciated from the LSAT, at least, the skill to be able to synthesize whatever I just read. So I think that made me realize how important it is to break down the stimulus in order to understand something, because in the beginning, when I was studying for logical reasoning, I didn't feel like I understood the stimulus enough, but because I was sort of rushed in time, I sort of went down to the answer choices first. And I'm like, okay, let me just look at the answer choices and figure out the question from there. But I figured, as time went on, that wasn't the right way to go about it. And that sort of dragged my score down. So just going back to what I learned from LSAT, just being able to read something and then synthesize it, because in law school, the amount of readings you have to go through is ridiculous, and it really helps to be able to read 20, 30 pages and then being able to summarize it and know exactly what the point is from those 30 pages.
Wow, that's a great point, Andy. I'm glad you raised it. A lot of times folks will read the argument, they'll read the stimulus, and they'll be like, I kind of get it, but I'm not really sure. Let me look at the question and the choices and see if those help. They're never going to help. They're never going to help. The choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus, because they're asking you to strengthen an argument or weaken an argument or find a parallel argument. How can you find a parallel argument if you don't know the original argument? How can you strengthen the argument if you don't know what the argument is that you're dealing with? And so slowing down and understanding the stimulus first, or at least understanding it in depth, is really important. In a way, the question stem type is almost arbitrary. I could take any necessary assumption stimulus and turn it into a flaw question. And I find it really useful to reframe it. If you say there's a gap in this argument, what flaw is the argument guilty of versus what is an assumption underlying the argument that the argument requires? It's pretty much the same thing. The only difference is whether we give the person making the argument the benefit of the doubt or not. But we're interpreting how reasonable the argument is, in other words. LSAT tells us how to view it. Are they reasonable or not? Doesn't matter. LSAT tells us the perspective. Either way, we still got to evaluate that gap. Also, something that you said, Mustafa, jumped out to me as well about how the LSAT relates to law school or not. And of course, you would imply that it does to some extent. And I think that's important to recognize because folks will say the LSAT's dumb, it doesn't test anything. And it's true, your LSAT score certainly does not define you. It does not define how well you will do in law school, does not define how you will be as an attorney or whether you'll even pass the bar. But there is still some relationship specifically between LSAT scores and first-year law school grades. That is the correlation. That's why the LSAT is considered a valid and reliable admission test, but it's not meant to indicate how successful one will be in their legal career, certainly.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And as I mentioned, the benefits are certainly they show themselves when you're completing the readings and even when you're in class. So speaking of the LSAT, and what like we understand there's a new LSAT now, LSAT Flex. How different is that from the LSAT that Annie and I wrote a few years ago? What are some of the major differences, and how should students, I guess, prepare themselves for this new LSAT Flex than they would have had it not changed?
Yeah, great question. So the LSAT Flex is more similar to the regular LSAT than it is different. So you've still got logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. The question difficulty is no more or less than the regular LSAT, and law schools do not care which one you take. So a 180 on the Flex is just as good as a 180 on the regular. A 160 on one is just the same as a 160 on the other. Law schools do not care. LSAC has vouched for the Flex as being equally reliable, equally valid, and law schools take them at their word, and they should really, because they're really sticklers for specifics. They're big on their data analysis. They wouldn't put this out if they didn't think it was a good exam. That being said, though, of course, there are some differences, especially in terms of how students should prep. So first off, why is there an LSAT Flex? Because of COVID. They can't administer the LSAT in person. It would be too difficult to do it with proper social distancing and such, finding locations and whatnot. And it would be hard to wear a mask that long anyway, and taking an exam in a cramped space, certainly. And so people are doing the LSAT Flex at home or at a hotel. From basically, you get to choose the environment as long as you have a good Wi-Fi connection, a good device, and nobody's going to be walking around in the background or interrupting you. So it's at home, online, 3 sections, not 5. You said earlier, Mustafa, 2 sections of logical reasoning on the regular, not the case on the Flex. The Flex only has 1 logical reasoning section, 1 games, 1 reading comp, and no experimental. So they've removed the experimental section. They've also removed 1 of the logical reasoning sections. So it's shorter, 3 35-minute sections, and you're done in 2 hours. So that's nice. I mean, assuming you've got a good place to take it, you're done in 2 hours and you can do it wherever, no other test takers around. I think it's pretty good for most people. If you don't have a good device, or you don't have a good internet connection, or you don't have a good home environment, it's fine. LSAC will hook you up. They'll give you a loaner device. They'll even reimburse you up to $125 to take it at a hotel. So it's not going to be the Ritz-Carlton, but it should be hopefully good enough.
That's great.
Oh, sorry.
I wish that was the case when we were taking the LSAT. Instead of 5, 3 sections, that's pretty helpful.
Yeah, I guess just building off of that point, logical reasoning was actually, one of the more opposite from you, Mustafa. I just couldn't do reading comp. So how do you think, Steve, this affects students who are sort of reliant on logical reasoning to boost their score? Because suddenly you have 1 LR section when you can have 2 in the in-person LSAT. Does it make a difference?
That's a very reasonable question because, of course, while the regular LSAT and the Flex are said to be similar, obviously there's a difference in percentage. Logical reasoning was half. Now it's approximately 1/3. And so if you loved logical reasoning, you may not love the Flex. You might want to say, well, I would prefer the in-person when it's available, but who knows when that will be. So theoretically, you could wait until there's a regular LSAT, if and when there will be a regular LSAT in the future. I certainly hope, fingers crossed. But I also love the Flex and the benefits of taking it a shorter exam, taking it from the comfort of your own home and such. But if you love logical reasoning, what do? Well, I would say, first off, focus more on reading comp prep, because reading comp and logical reasoning are somewhat closely tied. In both cases, you're evaluating difficult, dense text and answering questions about it. The difference is that a reading comp passage is a lot longer than a logical reasoning stimulus. But I would encourage folks to try and at least get a sense of what the similarities are between the two, looking for those arguments in reading comp, even if they're a bit more buried, and devote more time to reading comp, because reading comp is actually the largest section percentage-wise. Even though there are 3 sections, reading comp has the most questions on the exam. So games has approximately 23 questions, reasoning has approximately 25, and reading comp has approximately 27. So reading comp gets 27 questions out of approximately 75. So it's actually the most significant percentage-wise. So I would say folks may want to spend a little bit less time on logical reasoning prep than they would have for the regular LSAT, and a bit more time on games and reading comp.
So just off of that, how do you suggest students study for reading comp? I've heard a lot of prep books that focus on logical reasonings and logic games, but not so many on reading comp. And I've heard the best way to study for reading comp is actually just taking prep tests like over and over. Is that true, or do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so reading comp is definitely not as sexy, doesn't get as much attention, but it's really important, especially on the Flex. And so I would suggest students, of course, do lots of passages, review them in depth, but obviously I want to say more than that. Like I said, I mentioned earlier, I do these reading comp deep dive sessions in my courses online, where we'll take one passage and go over it in excruciating detail, sentence by sentence, line by line, word by word. We'll go slowly. I will basically encourage students to summarize and paraphrase every single piece of the passage. Leave no stone unturned. Make sure you understand everything. And if there are certain vocabulary words you may not have previously known, I was doing a passage earlier this week with students in class, and we encountered the word histrionics. Histrionics is not a word that we typically use in everyday life. Not everybody knows what it means. And especially for non-native speakers, it can be tougher sometimes. And so folks will want to devote more time to it. Of course, look up words you don't know, but then also do what you can to understand the word in context. Save a running list of them, but also what would you do if you couldn't look it up on test day? How would you figure it out given the context, or how would you get around that word and still get a general sense of the tone and the direction of the passage? This takes time. So I wouldn't simply say, do exams and move on to the next ones. Do fewer passages, maybe even spend an entire day doing just one section, but reviewing it in depth, analyzing it, deconstructing it, dissecting it. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. I would also say summarize the main idea, paraphrase it, articulate it separately, or in a way pre-phrase it. So there are often questions on reading comp asking you, what's the main idea? What's the primary purpose? And so they're asking questions. This is of course a multiple choice test. So you don't need to fill in the blank with your articulation, but it can be useful to articulate it for yourself first to better spot it when LSAC uses, of course, their much more difficult description of it.
That makes total sense. I remember that one passage when I was writing my real LSAT. It was about peptides. And as an arts major, I had no idea what, peptides were and how they work. And when I saw that passage, I don't know, like my whole mind just went blank because I had no idea. And I was reading the words. I understood words, but not sentences. And I know a lot of students also struggle with that because part of LSAT, I guess, reading comp is to test you on various subjects. So regardless whether you're arts major, science major, you're going to have that one or two passage that you're uncomfortable with in terms of topic. How should students go about that? Should they, if I guess in my case, should I spend, 5 passages just on science, or do you think that's not how it should work because you never really get 5 science passages in a row on the LSAT? So
well, I would not try to construct the most difficult LSAT ever, pulling all the hardest reading comp, all the hardest logic games. That's a recipe for disaster. It'll make you miserable. No need to put yourself through that under timed conditions. But I would certainly work on science passages on the side and drill those if science passages give you trouble. I was a poli-sci major. Science didn't come naturally to me, but you can still get it. The key is to dumb it down for yourself, simplify it. You know how there's Wikipedia, then there's also simple Wikipedia that uses simple English. It avoids multisyllabic words, making it easier for non-native speakers. You can dumb down science passages to make it easy for non-science people. And so I'll often encounter science logical reasoning questions or science reading comp passages with difficult terms that I don't know, but there is oftentimes a place in the passage or in the stimulus where they define that key difficult word in an easier way. They might use an entire phrase rather than a single word, but even so, if you can latch on to that simple phrase that defines it and then sub in your own term and use your own term throughout, kind of like a find and replace function. So for example, let's say there's a question on acetaminophen. And if memory serves me correctly, acetaminophen is simply Tylenol, if I'm right about that. And so if that's the case, let's just pretend that's true and we'll look it up later. But anyway, so let's say there's a question that says acetaminophen, M dash, a pain reliever or fever reducer does blah, blah, blah. And then they keep using acetaminophen throughout the passage. If we assume that a pain reliever and fever reducer that is acetaminophen, we could just say Tylenol, and we all know what Tylenol is. You could just say Tylenol throughout for yourself, and that'll reduce some of the difficulty in navigating constantly if they use that difficult term 10 times throughout. You just made it easier for yourself, and you're kind of removing those roadblocks or speed bumps.
So as for logic games, what specific sort of advice do you have in terms of completing them correctly and most importantly on time? Because I personally, there were times that I struggled with like getting through all the games that were present there on the question in the test. So I would sometimes get like 4 out of the 5, for example, done. And then 5th one, I wouldn't even have time. So the questions for the 5th game, I would, for example, guess. So what specific advice or tips do you have for those students who are struggling with logic games, and how can they improve?
So there's 2 big ways to get better at games. And by better, I'll say faster, then I'll zoom out from there. So you get faster at games by making more inferences up front and maximizing your use of previous work. A lot of times, just as students will oftentimes go right into the questions in logical reasoning without thoroughly understanding the stimulus, in games, you have a stimulus also, and it's the rules and the initial setup that you could make from the rules. But you don't want to simply set up the game with the rules as they're given to you. You want to actually go beyond that and make inferences, looking to combine the rules together wherever you can. Oftentimes, if there is the same variable featured in multiple rules, you can link those rules together to derive an inference. And games is all about testing the inferences that they hope that you'd be able to make. Then maximizing use of previous work basically means that you draw hypothetical local scenarios over the course of the game, specific diagrams related to a particular question, but those are still valid diagrams in general. And so they may serve you later in the game as you're solving more general global questions. Now, for folks who have a hard time with accuracy on games, aside from the speed issues, I would encourage them to drill setups. So basically do a bunch of games, but ignore the questions at first. Just set up the games, making sure that you're diagramming the rules accurately, and you're making a diagram that best reflects the task they're asking you to perform. So some games are involving putting things in order or sequencing them. Other games involve grouping, where you're choosing some variables and not others, or associating variables of one category with those of a different category. So you want to make sure that you understand the task correctly, and you've created a diagram that reflects what they're asking you to do. So you can do these setup drills and then check your diagram against explanations and see how it matches up in style or accuracy, and then go from there.
So I guess having a really good understanding of what game types there are would be certainly helpful in answering the questions on time and correctly. Now, I also understand that one of those games that appear on the LSAT mostly might be a miscellaneous game that you have, I guess you're not familiar with the format of it, what advice do you have in terms of tackling that sort of game type?
Yeah, so I call these curveball games, but basically they're just simply games that don't fit the mold of a standard game. Like I said, ordering, grouping, those are pretty typical. There are plenty of those out there. People generally know what to do after they've studied for a while, but the curveball games, they throw folks for a loop. And I would say drill those, and I do say drill those, but you also got to understand that you can't blindly copy techniques for those because by definition, they're unique. So like, for example, like if you've seen a unicorn before, a unicorn isn't a unique animal, but seeing that won't prepare you to see a dragon because they're totally different creatures. So I would say basically get used to throwing yourself for a loop, get used to putting yourself in those uncomfortable, unfamiliar situations so that you can recognize that although the task may seem different, the diagramming style may be different, at the end of the day, the underlying theory is constant across game types. They're looking for you to make inferences. They're looking for you to take abstract rules and form a generalized interpretation for yourself that you can apply consistently throughout the game.
Awesome. Thank you.
I remember on one of my LSATs, a game threw me off, and turns out it was a circular game. And when I was prepping for the LSAT, I remember hearing people say, don't focus so much on the circular games because those sort of appeared in the older tests and not so much in the newer tests. And guess what? It showed up on my real LSAT. So I guess my question is it worth focusing on those games that are sort of not common when you're on a time crunch?
Yeah, so that's a thing that comes up a lot. And I was actually going to bring that idea up, which is that although there are curveball miscellaneous games that can throw folks for a loop, and they're obviously really scary when they come up and everyone talks about them online afterwards, unless you're scoring perfect or close to it on games, I would focus more on the more common game types first. So make sure you've got ordering down before you even look at mastering curveball games, because ordering is much more likely to show up and it's much easier and more common. So I would just say start there, ordering, grouping, then the more rare, unique types. But if you want a 170 plus, typically the breakdown is that those folks are getting perfect, maybe -1 on games, and then -3 or so on each of the other sections. So it's actually, what I mean is that it's easier to perfect games than it is to perfect the others. And so for folks looking for a top score, I would aim to master games.
And on that, I have a controversial question. So what is your opinion on skipping questions? Like when I see the substitute rule in games, or when I see parallel reasoning and logical reasoning, what is your take on skipping those questions to save some time?
Yeah. Well, parallel questions are among the toughest. And so I could understand folks certainly at least skipping them and wanting to save those for last. And I'm talking about parallel questions and logical reasoning. But rule substitution, everybody hates them. They're actually not that bad, to be honest. They just seem weird because they're kind of infrequent. They're at the end of the game. They seem to be changing the nature of the game, but they're actually not. The whole idea of a substitution is that you're not changing anything. So the 4 wrong answers are all changing something about the game. They're either more limiting than the original rule or less limiting than the original rule. And I actually taught an entire class just on these because people were asking me about them so much. But a key takeaway I'll share with everyone now is simply drill them on the side. They've appeared on nearly every single exam since exam 57, which was about 10 years ago. Not before that, but starting with the 57. So you just basically pull out all the games involving rule substitution and do only the setup and that single exact question for each of those games, and you'll see the patterns in how to approach them.
Okay, well, I didn't know that you could just pull out questions that have rule substitutions. And I guess just around that, let's talk a little bit about resources. So exactly on that, do you know of any resources that does that, where you can sort of narrow down a question that you're not super comfortable with, and then they'll sort of give you what question from what prep test focuses on those weaknesses?
Totally. Yeah, I've got it all on my website, the LSAT blog. I've got categorizations for everything. I've got categorizations for logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension. So I've laid out ordering games by type and by difficulty, logical reasoning by all the 15 different question types, reading comprehension by topic, and not just humanities, social science, natural science, law. I actually broke it down more specifically to say, okay, well, these are all the passages dealing with objectivism versus subjectivism in philosophy, and also as it applies to science. So if you don't like that topic, you don't know the idea of what it's about, you can drill those passages. And I've done it for rule sub as well. For logic and rule substitution questions, I've categorized those and listed them. I've done the same for the curveball games, the miscellaneous games. And so the idea of pulling out certain things to focus on, I mean, you could do whatever you want. You don't have to just do the exams as they're laid out, 4 sections as they're in the published exams, and doing them in order or timed. LSAT kind of mixes everything up, but folks like me make it our mission to dissect the exam, to deconstruct it and lay things out by type so you can work specifically on what gives you trouble. And I've laid this all out in my LSAT study plans as well to remove all the guesswork about what to do.
That sounds great. Also, I'm just noticing there's some questions coming in, and I think we're going to be addressing those questions. So the first question we have is, can we discuss more of what the LSAT actually looks like scored and how it compares to a regular LSAT in terms of scoring? So what the LSAT Flex actually looks like.
Yeah, sure. So basically, LSAC has created a system called Law Hub. And so inside your lsac.org account, you can see exactly what the Flex and digital format looks like. Basically, it was initially created for a tablet for the previous digital LSAT. Now it's a Flex, so there's a countdown timer. You can increase or decrease the text size. You can highlight and underline. So it's pretty cool. You could flag questions simply. You can jump around to what you need to. So it's kind of cool. And they've made 2 exams available for free inside that account, exams 71 and 73. So go on, look at that. It's free. And then if folks want access to more of the exams, LSAC has made over 60 of them available in the digital and Flex format in a program called Law Hub at lawhub.lsac.org. Inside your account after you log in, it's $99 a year for access to over 60 exams. It's a great resource, and it's the only place you can see exactly what that Flex format looks like. As for scoring, it's still on the 120 to 180 scale, and they haven't released raw score conversions for the Flex specifically, but assuming that they keep using the Flex long term, if they decide to make it the new normal, then I assume they will release more about how exactly the scoring works. But for a rough approximation, you could take your accuracy on the 3 sections you complete, leaving out one of the LRs, the logical reasonings, and then simply multiply your raw score by 4/3 before translating it on the raw score conversion chart.
And sorry, just building. Yeah. Sorry, I just have a build off of that. So,
Sure.
The LSAT writing. So, is it any different in the context of LSAT Flex compared to in-person LSAT?
The LSAT writing is actually the same both pre and post COVID, pre and post the switch to the Flex, but actually last year, starting in June 2019, they changed the LSAT writing sample so that it was no longer at the testing center. They made it separate and they made it online. So that was actually a good way for LSAC to get used to what is it like to proctor something online and monitor folks with the security software, with the webcam and the microphone. And so you do the writing later, regardless whether it was in person or online. Starting in June of last year, it's at home, online, a separate session from the Flex. So you're doing it for 35 minutes, a separate session, likely a separate day if you want. And it's not scored, but because it's typed now and it's online, law school admission officers are more likely to be able to read it because it's not handwritten. And so they may take it a little bit more seriously than previous.
So there's a question here. What tips do you have for those struggling in arguments? Any resources to help?
Yeah, well, I've got plenty available online for free on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've done lots of breakdowns of different logical reasoning question types. And in particular, I would suggest folks look up that Socratic review method I mentioned to actually really get deep into the roots of what might be giving you trouble in terms of understanding an argument, understanding a stimulus, or getting tripped up by wrong answer choices.
Great. So if someone asks, if you don't like starting with a cold diagnostic test, where do you recommend students begin with their studying?
So typically, the reason I don't recommend a cold diagnostic, like I said, it can often be discouraging. And folks typically have to learn the same stuff anyway, because nobody really majors in LSAT in college, right? Something totally different, something totally new. I typically recommend starting with logic games because they are the most intimidating and foreign section for most pre-law students at first, but they're actually the most learnable section and the most perfectible. So I would start with games, specifically the easiest order in games, and working up from there. If you want to start with logical reasoning or reading comp, that's totally fine. Just make sure you cover everything in the end.
So I guess the next question actually is the opposite from that. So someone took a cold diagnostic, but I guess she's not sure where to start after taking the cold diagnostic, because like you have your score now and you know you need to study, but where do you start after that? And what are some resources to see where you should start?
Yeah, so I mentioned my LSAT study plans earlier. I've got super detailed day-by-day LSAT study plans showing you exactly what to do every single day over the course of your prep. And they follow what I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. So LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Just to briefly go through each of those, learning is theory, concepts, getting the basic rundown of what each question type involves. A is for accuracy, drilling questions by type, untimed. S is for individual timed sections. E is for exams and endurance, and R is for review. So LASER approach to LSAT prep, I have more on it. If you just search the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, I break it down. But basically, folks should start with taking each section, each question type, and going through that process untimed, then timed.
Sounds great.
We have Grayson asking, can we also discuss the study timeline to achieve the high score as well? For example, if your practice score was a 131, how would you create a study timeline with a full-time job?
So I would recommend, like I said earlier, allowing at least 2 to 3 months and ideally 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential. And of course, it's going to be harder if you're working a full-time job. If you're starting at a 131, of course, much depends on your goals, but there's still a lot to learn. So I'd recommend allowing plenty of time, closer to the 5 to 6 months in that case, and blocking off time in your schedule to make it happen. So with a full-time job, it could be tough, especially if there are also other obligations on top of it, like family. So you're going to want to block off time in your schedule, perhaps an hour before work, an hour during lunch, an hour after work, and most of it on the weekends. But you got to adapt things to fit your particular situation. You don't have to do 20 hours a week. Even 10 hours a week is better than nothing. Do what you can. And if you only have 5 hours a week, that's fine. Just allow a longer timeline to account for that.
So the next question we have is, what are some things to be aware of while testing the LSAT Flex? Do you have any horror stories to share or exam day hiccups that you've heard of?
Yeah, I don't want to scare anybody. Most administrations have been going fine recently. They've worked out a lot of the kinks since they started the Flex back in March of this year. Things don't always go perfectly, though. There are some things to be aware of. Specifically, make sure you have a really good internet connection. Because if your internet is shaky and it cuts out, that's a massive interruption. And during a timed exam, you definitely don't want to experience that. And so make sure your internet is solid, ideally plugging in your internet with an Ethernet cable rather than only using Wi-Fi. And if your at-home internet is not great, or you have roommates or significant others or family using the internet simultaneously, like if everybody is streaming Netflix or on Zoom calls at the same time, it's going to slow it down. Not recommended. If you can't make it work at home, again, reach out to LSAC and they will hook you up with a hotel to take it in. So they'll reimburse you to take it at a hotel. And then hopefully if the hotel has good internet, again, hopefully wired, you could have a smoother test day experience. Also, proctors are not always perfect. And so ask them before you start that if they're going to interrupt you or take over your computer for any reason, like security purposes, that they pause the clock so they don't take away time from you.
So we have Shanice asking, what tips would you recommend for studying in between LSAT exams? Let's say you did an exam in October and are planning to rewrite it in November.
So you've got about a 1 month gap between the October and November LSATs, and you wait approximately, in this case, close to 3 weeks for your score. So don't waste those 3 weeks. Make use of them if you're planning to retake. Maximize every day that you can, obviously, after having taken October. If you wanted to take a few days off, that's totally fine. But I would get back to it because a month is not a long time. I would think about, how did October go? What went well? what didn't go well, so you can learn from that experience to adjust for November. So maybe if the time of day you took October didn't work for you, maybe you want to schedule your November LSAT Flex at a different time of day that will work better for whatever reason. Or if you needed more of a warm-up than you got for October, maybe you want to do some warm-up questions before you start the November LSAT Flex. But in general, I would look to drill any weak areas, focus on what gives you trouble, and take maybe 1 or 2 timed exams a week and review them in depth.
Sounds good. And so what do you think is the outlook for future LSATs? So do you believe LSAT will continue the flex after social distancing as an option in addition to in person, or whatever your thoughts are on that? Or do you think it's going to continue?
Yeah, I do think it's going to continue for a while. As for whether it will be permanent, I can't say for certain, but I wouldn't be surprised. And if we look at the flex tests this year, LSAC was announcing their decision on the flex approximately 6 weeks before each test administration for each of May, June, July, August. But then for the November LSAT, they announced over 2 months prior. So it's kind of like even they were willing to admit that the November LSAT wasn't going to work for in-person. I suspect that both January and February will be flex. Beyond that, I can't say for certain, but if I had to guess, I would say it'll probably be flex for most, if not all, of 2021. And I can't see why they wouldn't do it long-term forever. They would have to add an experimental section at some point, though, because they've got to be able to test out future questions. So I would expect that they're going to add on an experimental and allow a bathroom break at some point, either between sections 2 and 3 or between sections 3 and 4. But they've got to let you go to the bathroom at some point. So I think they'll add one back in. So it'll be 4 sections, not 3 is my prediction if they make it flex long term.
The question here is specific to reading comprehension and logical reasoning. So the person wants to, I guess, discuss more the principal and inference questions, and also inference questions and logical reasoning. How to exactly, I guess, tackle them, and what would some tips be?
Good question. And so I'm going to focus on the inference part of that because I think it's more broadly applicable. You have it in both. And basically what you're looking for is something that is highly probable based on the stimulus or the passage. In some cases, not 100% guaranteed. It all depends on the exact wording of the question stem. But even though there's a little bit of wiggle room typically, and you can read between the lines a little bit, there is always support in the passage for whatever the correct answer is. And so I would always encourage students to, with whatever they have difficulty with or get wrong in inference, upon reviewing, go back to the exact lines supporting the given correct answer, and then think about what about the wrong answer choice may have tempted you and led you astray. What little key word in that choice pushed it over the edge to make it incorrect.
And I think one that's also broadly applicable to people is, what advice do you have on how to improve your score after taking the LSAT Flex? Received your score, but do not know what areas to improve on, since LSAT has not released your score sheet.
Yeah, it's always nice to be able to see your disclosed test form afterwards to know exactly what happened on the big day itself. But that's simply one test. You can take any practice test and get an indication of what you need to work on. So I would say pull any fairly recent exam, maybe something from the 70s and 80s that are the numbered exams, do one of those and score that and see what gave you trouble there. But in reality, any single exam is not the best data point because it's not a large enough sample. I would look at your most recent 3 to 5 exams and look at the trends in that larger pool of questions to see what gave you trouble. Because one exam only has 4 games, only has 4 passages. You may need a larger sample pool to figure out, are you really having trouble with a certain question type, or is it just that particular game or passage?
Thank you. And in terms of studying for LSAT Flex, a person wants to know if, when studying for LSAT Flex, should they take or practice with the 5 sections, or should they go ahead with 3 sections?
If you know that you're taking a flex, I would do 3. So for folks studying for the November LSAT, approximately a few weeks away from now, actually, I would say do 3 sections. You know it's a flex. You know it's going to be 3 sections. There's no reason to do 5. I understand the idea of pushing the limits with endurance a little bit And maybe you want to do that once or twice, but I don't see the reason to make that the default when you know you're doing a flex. For those doing January or February, taking the exam then, I do predict it'll be a flex, but I understand that you may not want to bet on that with doing only 3 sections, but LSAC will probably announce on those early enough that you could do plenty of 3 or 5 section exams given whatever they decide.
And Steve, I don't know if you can answer this, but someone was wondering, how are this year's scores trending compared to previous admission cycles? Are people scoring higher with more downtime and quarantine to study? I don't know if you have access to people's scores or if you have heard people telling you about their scores.
Yeah, well, LSAC hasn't released any data on this specifically, but the exams equated. I only know what I've heard anecdotally. So I could say that basically the exams are, I'll speak theoretically and then what I've heard anecdotally. So theoretically, exams are equated. So they're going to adjust the difficulty and the curve, the quote unquote curve for whatever people do in a particular test administration or a particular cycle. So it's not going to be any harder or easier regardless. It's not like they can just give more people 175s if people do better. They'll adjust the curve accordingly. But I could say that in general, I would also not assume that because people are in quarantine that everyone's automatically studying more. People have been thrown for a loop in a lot of ways. People are in uncomfortable or unique living situations because of COVID. If they're not going away to college, for example, or they move somewhere different, it could actually be harder to study when you've got family around. So I wouldn't assume that people are automatically going to study more. But then anecdotally, what I've heard is that actually I see more variation than I would have typically seen otherwise. So it's like some people perhaps, some people thrive under the flex format, others do worse. And so I would say to maximize your potential, really do what you can to simulate test day conditions specifically. So use Law Hub, use the online system, take your practice tests online. Don't study them out of books when you know you're doing the LSAT online, regardless of digital or flex. In North America, at least, you're doing it on a screen, not on paper. So prep accordingly.
So being in school full-time and balancing a part-time job in addition, what is a realistic goal to set for weekly amounts of time practicing the LSAT prep? So is that like 5 to 6 months? And how many hours roughly do you recommend? And a follow-up to that would also be, what year of undergrad would be a good time to begin studying for the LSAT?
Yeah, so school full-time and a part-time job on top of that, those are big obligations. I wouldn't expect anybody to do a ton of prep, and I wouldn't beat yourself up if you can't even meet the 10 hours per week that you laid out for yourself. That could be too much. Maybe some weeks it'll only be 5 or 6 or even less, and that's fine too. Just allow more time. So you said, I see in the chat, the person wrote 5 to 6 months. That's great. I like that this person is not trying to do it all in 2 months, given the other obligations. So 10 hours a week seems reasonable to me. Fit in more where you can. And if the exam gets closer and you haven't given it everything you want to do, postponing is totally fine. I see folks postpone all the time. And I would encourage folks to study for the LSAT when they'll have the most time to study. So that kind of ties into the other question regarding best year of undergrad to study for the LSAT and take it. It's whenever you have the time. Scores are good for 5 years. So if you have more time in junior year, study for it then, take it then. If you have more time during winter break or during summer break, study for it then and take it then. You could take it anytime you want. Again, the scores are good for 5 years, and law schools don't care if you took it this year or last year or 3 years ago. It's all the same to them.
Someone shared their experience in August Flex. So they took the August Flex and was kicked out of the exam multiple times because they're not sure if it was their internet connection or maybe the system was just overloaded, but they really want to avoid this from happening in their next retake. So would you recommend the person take advantage of the hotel voucher because they've heard stories about people performing badly because they used the voucher, but like it's a new environment. So what do you suggest they do in this case?
Yeah, that's a tough situation. I have heard of folks getting kicked out of the system sometimes, and I'm not sure exactly what the reason is, probably shaky internet. So I would say if that's the case, then yeah, take them up on the hotel voucher. It could be tough to take it in a different situation. There's no easy answer on that, though. It kind of just is what it is. I would say if you can get your at-home internet to be good and test out your system on ProctorU's site beforehand, there's a way. If you go to testitout.proctoru.com with hyphens, so test-it-out.proctoru.com, you can do an equipment check and check your internet as well to make sure that you're good with ProctorU. And I would do that at least maybe a couple days before the exam itself to make sure everything's squared away. You can also reach out to LSAC and they'll mail you a loaner device. If it's maybe a device issue specifically, I might try using a different computer or using LSAC's loaner and see if that works better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. This was very helpful, and I apologize for the people who we weren't able to answer all of your questions. You can feel free to follow us on Instagram, our page Legally Bright. We pair students, undergrad students with law students, and if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask us, and we will try our best to answer you. You can also reach out to Steve. His Instagram is also LSAT. His Instagram is LSAT Unplugged. Steve, is that the best place to reach you?
Yes, it is. So I'm all over the place. I'm on Instagram. I recently joined TikTok, so folks can find me there as well. I've got the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, the podcast, the Facebook group, Instagram, TikTok. I also have the LSAT blog, and folks can feel free to reach out to me anytime if they need anything at all. I'm really happy to help however I can.
Awesome. Annie, I guess you can take a screenshot before we leave for our social media.
Yes, let me just do that right now. Okay, great. I got it.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Steve. This was very helpful, and I hope that, the attendees found it as helpful as we did. And best of luck to whoever is going to take the LSAT, and we wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.
Steve.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.